If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, you might have asked this basic question. Just what did they get right, and what was creative liberty? 2 years ago, I was on this podcast with my friend Chris and his friend Luke, where they asked me to evaluate 7 different war movies to see how accurate they are. And The Patriot was obviously one of them. My take, fictional, but with plenty of allusions to real people and real events. Benjamin Martin, as played by Mel Gibson, is an amalgamation of 3 different American commanders: Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens. Of the 3 of them, only Francis Marion, better known as the Swamp Fox, was born in South Carolina. The other two were actually born elsewhere, and they moved to South Carolina before the war or during their childhood. And at the beginning of the war, there were 2 key events that shaped the course of the movie: the loss of the city of Charleston and the Battle of Camden.
I'm not going back.
No, I didn't expect you would. That Gates is a damn fool. He spent too many years in the British Army. Going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats in open field. It's madness.
Now, before I begin, I want to talk about the Fat Electrician. This is this hilarious YouTuber, former military, big guy, and some of his one YouTube channel, he calls it the Fat Files. Well, those who have seen me in person know that I'm not as big. And in fact, I will never be the big. So maybe I'll call this the Skinny Files. Well, to understand the Battle of Camden, we have to kind of back up. We have to talk about a guy named Horatiogates that Benjamin Martin mentioned, that he was a damn fool. He spent too much time in his British army expecting a stand-up fight. Well, who is Gates? Horatiogates was born in Essex, Great Britain in 1727. His mother became a housekeeper to the 3rd Duke of Bolton, and his father was a vintner. Remember, this is the 18th century, where you stay in your socioeconomic class. And the only way to advance was either join the military or make a lot of money. And remember, as I said, Gates's mother was a housekeeper to the Duke. She used that influence to help her son raise the money to join the British Army. And that is what she did. In the world of the British Army in the 1700s and well until the middle of the 1800s, if you want to be an officer, you usually bought your commission. The key exceptions were the School for Artillery and Engineering, where you require proper schooling in algebra and trigonometry. Barring that, all the other branches, such as the infantry and cavalry, were pretty much up for auction. Now, that's kind of like the gross simplification. There are other exceptions. There are battlefield commissions, but by and large, if you want to be an officer, you generally have to have a lot of money, and usually you're from the landed classes. There were no formal schools like West Point. West Point would not be commissioned until 1802. Annapolis for the U.S. Navy would not be started until 1845. So go back, this is about 60, 70 years before that. Everything else was literally on-the-job training. Now, you might be used to ordering people around because you were an aristocrat, but that's not the same thing as actual military leadership. In 745, Gates became an ensign or a sub-lieutenant, which is the lowest ranking officer. Gates served with the 20th Foot Regiment and actually saw some combat in Germany during the War of Austrian Succession. The following year, Gates went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. While in Canada, he was promoted to captain in a different infantry regiment, the 45th Foot Regiment. At that time, Gates also saw some action against the native Canadian tribes. 9 years later, in 1754, Gates sold his commission as a captain and purchased another captaincy, and this time in New York as a provisional uh, regiment. And this would be his first time in America. And don't forget, back in the 18th century and the 1900s, people didn't really go far. For Gates to travel from England to the New World was pretty much a major step. In 1755, Gates was on the ill-fated expedition with General Braddock. Here, the British Army was moving west into the Ohio Valley River and some of the areas controlled by the Native American tribes that were allied with the French during the French and Indian War. And during this expedition, Braddock and the British Army kind of kept to a very traditional British European model of war. March up the valley road, single road, attack the main continent, main settlements, and then retreat or capture it. Well, that's not the way the Native American tribes fought. They sniped at them from cover, they raided the rear, and then they just kind of harassed the column so that the main column would be forced to retreat in further disarray. In this campaign, Gates was wounded early, so he did not see much combat afterwards. At this point, Gates was found to be an excellent administrator. He was made brigade major in 1759, which is a very good promotion. Being a brigade major meant that he was an advisor and confidant to the commanding generals. And so anyone as brigade major was very likely to be groomed for a higher command, right? And this would be very important in Gates' career later. So in 1769, Gates sold his major's commission. Why? Remember, his father was a vintner and his mother was a housekeeper to a duke. The rank of major would be the highest he would be able to rise. If he wanted to be a lieutenant colonel or higher, that meant he had to own land and kind of become gentry. And that meant he had to either get gentry in America or somewhere else. In 1772, Gates moved south from New York to Virginia, where he met with George Washington again. These men kind of knew of each other while serving with General Braddock. So if you're senior officers, you kind of know of each other. You kind of figure out who do you like, who to trust, and who to kind of build networks with, or vice versa. It's like who to avoid like the plague. At this time, Gates bought a small plantation in Virginia, and this is where he's gotten his part of his dream, that he's now landed gentry, even if it's America. When the American Revolutionary War began, Gates rushed to Mount Vernon and offered his services to Washington. His services were accepted, and in 1775, Gates was commissioned as Adjutant General of the Continental Army. As an Adjutant General, he was the senior administrator of the Army. Think of a vice president of peoples in the American corporation. He was responsible for the Army's pay, uniform, decorations, promotions, and standards and records. And remember how I said Gates gained recognition in the British Army as an administrator? This role is perfect for him. And what is more, he is now a general. At this point, Gates looks like he's one of the good guys, and the story would stop. But Gates has one major problem: his ego. And just like Top Gun, where Maverick was writing checks, his ego is writing checks his body can't cash, Gates is going to have a very similar problem. By contrast, George Washington has never served a single day in the British Army. His commission during the French and Indian War was a commander of the Virginian colonial troops. It was less prestigious, even though it was a higher rank, than being a general or even major or colonel in the British Army. Washington had other strengths. Washington inspired loyalty. He was extremely competent. And even when he's lost battles in 1777, He used the opportunity to learn. And above all, Washington never gave up hope. Even more above that, Washington was very humble, and maybe too humble. By 1777, Gates longed for an active command. During his time in the British Army, he was there. He was just there with minimal action. He had seen some combat, but did not lead men to victory. Gates was now feeling that, hey, he should have overall command. After all, he had served 9+ years, 10+ years in the British Army. He had gained other experiences. He was a brigade major. He was kind of earmarked for higher command had he been born an aristocrat in England. Why should I not be in command? Surely that qualifies for high command, right? Not exactly. Now, would you consider someone who reports to you but is trying to get you fired a good person? No. Ages pass, and probably ages in the future, there will always be people who are, one, self-promoters, and two, trying to get you fired. In 1777, well, Gates actually got his wish. Fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to see it, Gates's number two at that time was Benedict Arnold. And at this point in 1777, Arnold was still a patriot, and his betrayal would not be for another 3 more years. If you remember anything about Benedict Arnold from history, besides his betrayal, he also was a very prickly personality. He was very sensitive about his time as a general and how he should have been promoted faster than some people, or on the same rate as other people whom he considered his subordinates or inferior. So right away, these two men did not get along. Yet, despite their antipathy towards each other, they achieved the impossible. They beat the British Army in a stand-up fight, which is called the Battle of Saratoga. After the battle, Gates wrote home trying to claim the lion's share of the credit, even though he had very multiple capable subordinates. Men like Daniel Morgan, John Stark, and a few others who definitely got the credit, definitely got the correct accolades that, yes, they contributed to victory. It was not just because of Gates as he claimed. Once again, Gates' ego got the better of him as he tried to capitalize his victory at Saratoga by trying once again to get Washington fired. After all, in 1777, Washington's command was on the defensive for most of the year. Washington had not won any major victories that year. His last major accomplishments were at the end of 1776. And during 1777, one of the biggest losses to the American cause was the loss of Philadelphia, the capital. However, Washington had plenty of friends in Continental Congress who kind of told Gates to shut up. Washington is still in command, and we will still have trust in Washington as the commander-in-chief. Washington had other plans for the year 1777. And during that winter, he led the army out of the Philadelphia area and into a place called Valley Forge. There, through a regiment of drills, the Continental Army got even tougher. Washington had some of the best drill masters and trainers from the Prussian army, which was one of the best at that time for drills and toughness and discipline in Europe, and he had them come over and train them. Coming out of winter quarters, the Continental Army in 1778 scored major victories. It was a completely different army. One of the key battles that the Patriot did not consider was the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, where in a stand-up fight between the Continental Army and the British Army, the Continental Army stood its ground, fought like lions, and scored a victory. The British were forced to leave the battlefield defeated, which is a sign of defeat, right? So Washington now has more and more wins in his wins column. By 1780, the war became stalemate. Washington had printed the British Northern armies in New York City. Now, back then, colonial armies were much, much, much smaller, right? In 1778, 79, the British Army at most was about 15,000, 20,000 people. The Continental Army was about even smaller. It would be like 5,000, 12,000 men for all the regular troops. And after it was augmented by the local militias and the local irregular troops, we'll talk about in the future, and also the French. By comparison, in Europe, 12,000 men was just one division in an army of 50 or 60 divisions. So thus, Washington could not capture New York. Standard military doctrine says in order to besiege a city, you need a 5-1 or even 10-1 advantage for you to capture that city. Washington could not capture New York City. So you had to settle for the next best thing. Pin them strategically down. But remember, war is a full democracy. The enemy always gets a vote. Because the British Army could also read a map. Without forces to fight the Americans in the north and the French who had joined the war as American allies, the British had to come up with a new plan. British Army General Sir Henry Clinton decided to go south. You can see at the bottom the city of Charleston. Until its capture, Charleston, or Charlestown, was the major southern seaport in rebel hands. As long as that port was open, traders could come in and out and bring vital supplies and trade to support the cause. Much like the first season of Andor, Monmouth is trying to raise money to fund the rebellion because wars are not cheap. After all, Operation Iraqi Freedom in the 2000s cost US $3 trillion. Trillion dollars. Now, in the British hands, after a short siege, which surprised everyone, the Americans were now in trouble. Whereas the Southern Army under American General Benjamin Lincoln was caught up in the surrender. No port, no army. In May 1780, news of Charleston's surrender reaches the North. The Continental Congress votes Gates' command of the Southern Theater. Again, why would they do so? Why would they go with Gates, who's trying to keep Washington fired, who thinks he's in charge? First, Gates was pretty much a senior as the Major General. Second, he had won the Battle of Saratoga. By comparison, Washington had both wins and losses. But unlike sports, there's never the next game, let alone the next season. Gates took command of all the available forces from the Delaware and Maryland line regiments, along with the North Carolina and Virginia militias. Gates also the 8 field guns as artillery. Marching south, Gates arrayed his forces in standard formation. The weakest armies on the left and the strongest units on the right. That meant putting the North Carolina and Virginia militia on the left and his veteran Delaware and Maryland regiments on the right. Now, one of the horrible misconceptions of the American Revolutionary War is that the Continental Army was a bunch of misfits, half-trained units in uniform, while the Redcoats were an organized military. That myth needs to die. The Continental Army from 1775 to 1776 onwards was a proper military organization with ranks and a table of organization. All that was due to Horatiogates. And during the tough winter at Valley Forge, that army got even tougher. There was still an army going in, and there were better army coming out. What's more, both the Continental Army and the British Army made use of what we called irregular forces. The U.S. Army Opposing Forces Manual TC 7-100.3 defines irregular forces as armed individuals or groups who are not members of the regular armed forces, police, or other internal security forces. The distinction of being an armed as an individual or group can include a wide range of people who can be categorized correctly or incorrectly as irregular forces. End quote. And militia often falls under this definition of irregular forces. They may be organized like in a very flat organization with a captain, a lieutenant, one or two sergeants, a whole bunch of privates. That's it. They can come together and follow it as quickly as the need arises. They just do not report to the Continental Army or the British Army. And that was Gates's first mistake. By putting the Marshal on the left, that meant he was facing the cream of the British Army on the right. The second mistake that was not discussed in the movie The Patriot was condition of the Continental Army. Now, if you've seen some of the clips on The Patriot, you see for the Battle of Camden, the Continental Army soldiers were all arrayed in uniforms, but they were all scared. Trust me, everyone's scared. Okay. And that was kind of aligned with the narrative that, hey, Americans lost like an eventual battle and must fight in a guerrilla warfare. Again, this is not true. Now, today, the modern military goes into battle with proper boots, a ruck, body armor and a rig, helmets, and an automatic rifle. The ruck usually has a proper camelback hydration system that can carry a gallon of water. They also can carry MREs, which are designed in a food lab. Now, some MREs have a bad rep. The veggie omelet is one of those I've heard consistently do not get the veggie omelet. On the day of the battle, on May 16th, August 16th, 1780, it was a typical hot, humid day. If you ever lived in the South, you will know in the summer, temperatures could be in the high hundreds, low 90s, high hundreds, and with the humidity as almost 90%. So wearing clothing from New York, from the north, like typically New York, going into the South, and marching through Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, the Continental Army must have been sweaty and ready to faint. They had been marching 3 years straight. On top of that, the Americans had no time to make proper foods, but they actually ate uncooked potatoes. So no surprise, they got diarrhea and pretty much wanted to die. If you want to know what that feels like, go on a 50-mile hike wearing winter clothing on a hot, humid day and eat only uncooked potatoes while carrying another 40 pounds on your back. And when you reach your destination, you're supposed to sign up and fight. Yeah, no. Good luck with that. So that was what some of the American soldiers were feeling experienced that day. And it's kind of no surprise they lost. Gates's third mistake. He underestimated Cornwallis, who was a much better general than General Burgoyne, whom Gates faced at the Battle of Saratoga. At the same time, he overestimated the abilities of the American militia. Much like sports, in baseball, most teams can pretty much beat the Rockies. But when you face much better established teams with a very good batting, infield, and pitching staff like Dodgers, Yankees, Red Sox, that's a different game. And this is what Gates was up against. He had gone against inferior generals, and now he's up against a top general.
strategy, Major?
Yes, sir. Come over from supply.
Were you good at that?
Yes, sir.
Well, then stick to it, because you're a walking clusterfuck as an infantry officer.
When the battle was lost, Gates rode 80 miles to Gainsborough for 3 days straight to report to Congress. He left behind the remnants of his army minus the supplies and baggage. And in the biggest CYA of the war, Gates made sure he was never court-martialed or face a board of inquiry. It would fall to much more capable generals like Daniel Morgan and Nathaniel Greene to lead the Continental Army to victory in the South. In fact, Greene was Washington's first choice over Gates. The reason why Washington was overruled was because Gates was senior and Gates had made his lobby to the Continental Congress. Gates was certainly a fool. Washington had certainly got his wish and appointed his dream team, right? And these guys were aggressive, but they're not reckless. They had better appraisal of what the local militia could or could not do. They certainly worked with Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, to make sure the British were pinned down and sniped at and attacked and in the rear areas, and he eventually kind of defeated the British Legion, which is a small unit attached to the regular British Army. The British Legion was under Ambassador Tarleton, who was the inspiration for Colonel Tavington in the movie. In 1781, at the Battle of Cowpens and later in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Morgan and Greene trapped the British Army on battles of their choosing and forced the British Army to retreat further away from Charleston. They would force the British to go to a small town in Virginia called Yorktown. And there, Cornwallis was signaled that he would require supplies and more men and figure out how to salvage the situation. But now Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown. And you would say, as we say, the rest is history. That's all. Thanks for watching.